Hello and welcome to the lecture of International Business Environment. In this lecture, we will going to have a discussion on the International Financial Institution, that is Unit 13 of Block 3. In Unit 13 of Block 3, we will actually going to have a discussions on Introduction, International Monetary Funds, World Bank, International Finance Corporation, International Development Associations, and Regional Development Bank. Now, yes, in this session we will actually got in a discussion about all that financial practices which is occurred in the international practice. If we discuss or if we consider the starting form or the introduction form in all that practices of finance, after having the World War II, it is what the requirement of a nation to bring out the stability in the world trade. And yes, it is what to restore all the international practices, bring out economic stability and growth in the world trade. It is just now, this is not the only a demand for the one, everyone is looking for these things. The other major concern was to have international communities, have those international practices which bringing out better concerns. In that sense, yes, they required a certain kind of mechanisms and certain kind of practices to work out this kind of exercises. So in that, the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank of Reconstruction and Development comes into a picture, which is very popularly known as a World Bank, which is set up in 1945. It is what basically was considering all that development required in the financial sector. The basic purpose of creating them is to put out a booster for all those developing nations who actually perform in the world trade and the world practices. So in whole this unit, we will actually going to have a discussion in all those institutes who are working in that practices and who are working as now performing as a major role in stabilizing the economy and playing a very important role to bringing out the growth in the world trade. Yes, and this institution is having a practices to bringing out that stabilities in the economies, and they basically tries to work at the practices to make the rich capital countries or get the funds from rich capital companies and invest it into the poor capital countries. So that comes into the major roles of these institutes. Now, what are basically the International Monetary Fund? IMF is the international organization. The basic purpose of creating the IMF is to bringing out the proper exchange rate and have that stability in the international exchange rate. Bringing out the major concept is what, जो IMF का जो major concept है, वो major concept यही है कि जब आप एक राइट और स्टेबलाइज्ड इकोनॉमिक प्रैक्टिसेस को लेकर आओ, एक इकोनॉमी में स्टेबिलिटी लाने के लिए और एक प्रॉपर डेवलपमेंट के लिए ही आईएमएफ की कंडक्शंस हुई थी, एंड इट वाज बेसिकली कंडक्टेड. इट इज बेसिकली एन ऑर्गेनाइजेशन फॉर्म टू स्टेबलाइज द इंटरनेशनल एक्सचेंज रेट एंड फैसिलिटेट द डेवलपमेंट, जो इंटरनेशनल एक्सचेंज रेट की स्टेबिलिटी पर काम करती है और उसे फर्दर डेवलपमेंट करती है. दैट मीन्स दे वर कंसीडरिंग ऑल दी ओवरसीज फाइनेंशियल सिस्टम. ये एक होल ओवर वर्ल्ड की पूरे फाइनेंशियल सिस्टम की टेक केयर कर रहे हैं कि किस तरह से हर एक नेशन जो है अपनी एक्सचेंज रेट पर काम कर रहा है. एंड यस, एट द सेम टाइम दे वर वर्किंग ऑन द बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट. व्हाट आर दोस बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट्स आर वर्किंग. सो दैट इज व्हाई IMF is basically conducted to give the assistance for them in the terms of finance and in terms of technical also. So ये technical और financial assistance देने में काम करता है हर अपने member को and make an international lender. So they become basically the lender for the developing country who wants to borrow the funds from them. Now, what are those major objective of IMF? IMF के क्या major objective हैं? सबसे पहला objective is the mechanism to give out the monetary supports to their members. जितने भी members IMF के हुए हैं, वो सब members जो हैं उन्हें further support के लिए या monetary assistance के लिए IMF is created. So, and yes, at the same time, that is why it's called as that, to promote the corporation by providing the machinery for consulting collaboration by member on the international monetary issues. किसी भी तरीके के मॉनेटरी इश्यूज पर कंसल्टेंट लेने के लिए, कोलैबोरेशंस के लिए, it is what basically bring out to promote that cooperation. So that is what the very first objective of IMF. Another is to facilitate the balanced growth of international trade. Yes, to bringing out that financial practices in the better term. It is the second objective of IMF. Third is to promote the exchange stability and facility that avoidance of a comparative currencies depreciations. That is what to bringing out that exchange stability, जिसकी वजह से एक better working हो सकती है और जो कि एक comparative working environment में currency depressions को रोकती है. So in that case, yes, so we can state from these objectives, one of the major objective is to have a better financial assistance, making out the BOP adjustments, balance of payment adjustment में ये help करते हैं. So that's all comes into the objective of IMF. So next is the functions of IMF. If we talk about the functions of IMF, so the very first function is to formulate and administrate the code of conduct. जब किसी भी तरीके की mechanisms या किसी भी तरीके की taken cares होती हैं चीजों को लेके. So yes, the very first is to code of conduct, to come up with that practices or to come up with that processes जिसके अंदर हम लोग एक proper working बता सकते हैं. And this code of conduct is basically related to the exchange rate of policies. कि exchange rate किस तरह से होगा, क्या उसकी policies होंगी, what are those restrictions which are considered on that. So that is what the very first function of IMF. Second function is to provide the members with the financial resources. Again, yes, provide that financial resources is the major objective. कि जितनी भी developing countries हैं उन्हें एक better working के लिए financial and monetary support देना. But yes, at the same time, वो financial support कैसे दी जाएगी? What are those code of conduct was required and what are those practices which are must be required, like for example to submit the securities and to submit the practices. So that is what comes into the things which we will consider. So that is to provide the members with the financial resources to enable them to observe the code of conduct. कि किस तरह का code of conduct है और कैसे वो financial resources जो हैं provide करवाए जाएंगे. So that comes into the second functioning. Third function is to provide a forum in which the IMF could consult with one another and collaboration on the international monetary matters. What जो कि हमने सबसे पहले objective में discuss किया था कि the major function is to bringing out the proper coordination and cooperations when it comes to the international monetary matters of all those members. So that is why उस case में एक forum provide करवाना is the function of it. That is what bringing out a correct practices on that working, so that could be consulted with the one another and collaborate on that particular matter. Now if we talk about the IMF, this is the what basic understanding of IMF to have the idea about the objective and functionings of IMF. Now this thing is, what is the exchange rate policies? Exchange rate policies of IMF is basically giving us the idea that how the exchange is actually occurred when it comes to get the monetary practices or monetary fund from the IMF. जब हम एक monetary funds को generate करना चाहते हैं, so हम उस monetary funds को किस तरह से regulate करेंगे? What are those exchange policies or exchange rate was basically conducted. So major objective of this is basically that to avoid that descriptive fluctuations and rigidity to prevail under the international gold standard. International gold standard or the gold standard is basically considered as the one of the valuating of the economy. अगर हम एक economy के exchange rates में आते हैं तो उसके लिए we consider the international gold standards. So इसका जो main objective है to manage that fluctuations. So it is what basically to consider किस fluctuation से किस economy में कैसे effects आ रही हैं. So that comes into exchange rate policy. That is why it is related, because it is one of a necessary thing to understand the fluctuations of that in the international gold standard. If they fluctuate, definitely there was a fluctuation in the price specific flows. There is no, they indirectly affect the BOP adjustment. So that is what they bring out the effect of all these. एक stability नहीं आएगी, stability से proper capital formation नहीं होगी, BOP adjustments नहीं होंगी, and yes, at the same time एक price stability भी generate नहीं हो पाएगी. So in that case we required a proper understanding with that exchange rate policies. If we talk about the current system of exchange rate determination, so in current rate exchange rate determination, there was two, or we can say that the major currency floating. Currency floating is one of the important concept in it, and one of that system which discussed with that, so that is what hybrid. It's basically in terms of there was n of practices which we can do in it. So when it comes to major currency floating, the very first is way to float out the things is to manage basis. When you actually managed the things with the adjustments, so that comes into on the basis of managed. Then second thing is when some currencies have a free floating. When the currency have a free floating, so automatically yes, in those basis they come into the exchange rate. Free floating की वजह से वो exchange में आ सके, and then there may be a method of moving in and out of a various type of pegged exchanges rates relationship. That is what kind of agreements two other parties have, and वो किस तरह से exchange practices को कर रहे हैं. So that comes into the exchange system of exchange rate determinations. When it comes to having a surveillance over the exchange rate policies, yes, it is one of the required thing from IMF. That is what to have a control and have an understanding about the exchange rate policy. So in that case, yes, there are three principles to be considered out. The very first is the obligation of a member to refrain from manipulating exchange rate to prevent the BOP adjustments. That is what to put out the obligations on the members. जितने भी IMF के members हैं, they have an obligations to bringing out the right practices in the exchange rate, and yes, at the same time manage all the BOP adjustments. जितनी भी आपकी BOP adjustment से बचने के लिए, या जहाँ BOP के misbalance और imbalance से बचने के लिए, you must have a proper exchange rate. So अगर exchange rate manipulate कम होगा, so automatically it have a minimum effect on your BOP adjustments. Second was the intervene in their exchange market. That is to have an interference in the exchange market of that particular members, that how they were actually occurring their practices. Then third is the member should take into the account the interest of the others members. Considered it when you were into the trade or the foreign trade. In that case, you have to consider the concept of the others party also. So that is what the third principle which is taken care by, that the member is able to understand what exactly the second party is looking from that particular trade, and how they will actually occur that exchange and exchange policies, exchange rate policies. Now, what are the financial resources and policies? When we discuss about IMF, how IMF is basically conduct that financial, how they can able to generate their finance. It's one of the important aspect also, how they will actually going to raise that fund. So in that case, IMF rules each member is assigned for the quotas. Every member of that particular IMF, they have their SDRs, and that SDRs have a specific quota. Through this, they can yes generate the finance and have that whole policy on that for the basis of two sources. So the very first source is a subscription by member, and another is borrowing. Subscription यानी कि member की subscription fees के साथ it's a kind of generating of funds in the particular practice, and yes at the same time जब किसी भी तरीके की borrowing generate होती है, तो उस borrowing से भी एक monetary funds practices और monetary funds को generate किया जाता है. So that comes into the financial resources and policies. It is one of the practice which can be done into the IMF. IMF, that is why it's an authority to supplement the ordinary resources by borrowing following official entities as well as the private sources. So they can generate their resources. They can borrow this official. We can if I say that borrowing is a one source, then yes, they can borrow the things from the official entities or from the private sector. And under the general agreement of the borrowers, they basically renew, revise and enlarge from time to time. So इसको enlarge भी किया जा सकता है, renew भी किया जा सकता है, revise भी किया जा सकता है. So that comes into the practices of generating the funds. Now, what are those financial assistance which is used at? The very first is financial operation and transaction of a fund are carried out through the general department and the SDR department. Yes, SDR again, if we stated in the previous slide also, they basically gives us the idea about that particular quotas, and every member have their quota, and they can rise up the fund from that. So in that case, the very first in the financial assistant is to bringing out the right practices to generate the funds. जब एक जनरल डिपार्टमेंट या SDR डिपार्टमेंट से फंड्स को जनरेट फाइनेंशियल ऑपरेशन और ट्रांजैक्शंस कंडक्ट होती हैं तो दे मस्ट बी कैरिड आउट इन द प्रॉपर मैनर. द फंड्स प्रोवाइड्स BOP असिस्टेंस. जितने भी फंड्स राइज अप होंगे दे वाज basically rise up to bringing out betterment in the BOP assistance, and yes, by selling the member exchange of their own currencies. The member to which the fund sells currency or SDRs are said to be making a purchases from the fund. So in that case, yes, the one person is selling that fund and another is basically purchasing that funds. Now, what are those facilities which are basically assisted by these transferring or having this kind of SDRs practices? So the number of practices are provided to give the assistance, financial assistance. The very first practice is reserve kit drawings. It is what basically discussing about that member have a right to drawing to the extent of the funds holding of its currency in the general agreement. That is what when the organization can generate the funds according to their holdings in that particular agreement. The second is facility is what the credit trans facilities. This is what having the funds on the basis of more than your credit facility. That is, you can generate a funds on the credit practices. Then third is extend fund facilities. This is basically taken as a loan for a longer duration. Then next is buffer stock financing facility. Funds are basically provided to help the finance members to approve the buffer stocks. Next is to have a facility or providing the facilities for the low income countries. ESAF basically stands for the Enhanced Structural Adjustment Facilities. So this facility is basically provided to enhance the practices and provide the financial assistance to the low income countries. Now, what is SDD? SDR, as we discussed that yes, it's a special drawing rights which the member of IMF have. This kind of special rights are basically have a baskets of currencies. That means when the country having a chance to yes have a benefits for that. If they want to generate a funds, so they can have a baskets of major currencies. So in baskets of major currency, they use in the international trades and finance. That is working out proper international trades and finance. Another is currency in the baskets are they may be weighted according to the dollars. They may be weighted according to the euro, yens, pounds. In that case, yes, they have a mixed drawing. So they can generate this kind of drawings also. To determination of the currency in the SDR baskets basically are the amount which is specified by the IMF. That is what the amount which is given by IMF. So it is major determinations for that. What are those purpose of generating SDRs for that? SDR basically bringing out the unit of account by IMF and several other international organizations. They basically use as a unit. And it is one of the unit of IMF. ये एक IMF का part है और इसका basic काम होता है कि जब हम special की drawings चाहते हैं, so in that case SDR basically comes into a function. SDR were originally created or replaced by the gold and silver. अगर हमें gold and silvers में dealings नहीं करनी, so in that case we can work as जो कि हमने previous slide में discuss किया कि dollars, euro, yen, इनमें भी वो exchange और वो drawings हो सकती हैं. And yes, at the same time, paper gold is a little more than an accounting transactions within the ledger account. So paper gold is one of the functioning in it also. So in that session, we will actually having the basic understanding of IMF, what exactly the IMF functioning is and how IMF is basically performed, and what is SDR, and what are those facilities which are provided by the IMF. So this is all about for today's session. We are winding up here. Thank you so much. IGNOU MOOCs.